When it comes to preventative maintenance, I am a very firm believer in the visual inspection. Now, a visual inspection can be something as simple as just pulling out the dipstick and checking the level of your engine oil. You know, that's something you should do probably every gas fill-up. But you'd be amazed at how many people, they never even check the oil in their car, and then they, you know, whine and complain when they have some major problem. So you need to develop the art of the visual inspection. Now, this can be modified depending upon your own driving habits, but at least every 3 months you should get your head inside the engine compartment and really look it over. Now, on these newer Mercedes that have the engine cover, you'll have to pop the engine covers off because there's things that can be going on underneath those covers that you won't see by just, you know, opening the hood and looking at the engine. It means a lot more than just looking at the engine from 5 feet away. Get a good flashlight and really go from one side down. You're looking for staining around the exhaust, you're looking for exhaust leaks, you're looking for oil leaks around the valve covers, and on down into the front of the engine, you're checking the serpentine belt tension and condition, looking for any wetness around that front crank seal, and then coming around the other side, oh, look it over here. On my S500, I see a small oil leak that's developing on the breather cover. So sure enough, I could have left the cover on for the next couple of years, and I would have taken it off someday and have a big puddle of oil, or worse yet, I'd have oil dripping on the ground after a while. So this oil leak here, which you see, is very small but caught early. It can be fixed very inexpensively, and you can avoid some larger problems down the road. And I'm checking also the condition of the wiring, checking all the vacuum lines, particularly like on a diesel engine, on these fuel lines, fuel return hoses. You know, I've had people come in to the shop and you open the hood and fuel's leaking all over the place. And you wonder, did you ever think of just opening the hood and look? Oh no, I never thought of looking in the engine. And on these old diesels, you probably want to be looking close every time you open the hood to check the oil. Just look for oil leaks and fuel leaks. And particularly on these old cars, you may have to do a visual inspection more often. And then once a year, get the car up in the air. Get it up on jack stands, take the wheels off, inspect the brake rotors, the brake calipers, pads, axle boots. Look at the rear end for leaks. Look at the transmission, underneath the transmission for leaks. Check your flex discs. You know, there's a whole list of things that you could develop for your own visual inspection, but let me tell you, the visual inspection has really saved me. So let me tell you a story. Something happened to me almost 40 years ago to the month that made me a real believer in the importance of a visual inspection. The year was 1973. We had been in Indonesia only about 3 months. I had just completed my checkout in the Cessna 185, and I'd started to make regular flights from the coast into the highlands of New Guinea. And one particular day, I loaded up the airplane, took off, weather was okay, and headed into the highlands, almost 150 miles away. And it was a flight over about 100 miles of nothing but dense jungle and swamp, you know, full of crocodiles and snakes and who knows what else, before I got into the lower part of the highlands and then started flying up towards my home base. So I've been cruising along for about 50 minutes and just reached the entrance of the highlands and started to make a turn up the valley, and I was cruising at 9,000 feet, and I was just, you know, cruising along, everything was fine, and then all of a sudden, without any warning, the engine blew in my airplane, and something just went bang, and then all of a sudden you started to hear this clang, 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 clang in the engine compartment. Something was hitting the cowling, and it sounded like the whole engine was going to come off the mounts. So I immediately throttled back, and I thought, oh no, this thing is going down. I reached for the microphone, and I was grabbing it, and I was going to say, Mayday, Mayday. I thought, oh, just a minute now. I don't want to be an alarmist here. So I just called home base and said, you know, Mike Charlie Foxtrot, I'm developing an engine problem, and you know, I'll report in here when I figure out what's happening. And then all of a sudden I started thinking, I think there's an old abandoned airstrip around here. And I kind of looked out I kind of rolled the plane a little bit to the right and looked around, then I rolled the plane up to the left and I looked right out the window, and directly below me was an airstrip. You can imagine what was going through my mind at that point, but it didn't take long because I had to fly this airplane and get it down. The noise was continuing, but what was worrying me was I started smelling gasoline. And you know, that's probably a pilot's worst nightmare, is in-flight fire. So I pulled the throttle back, was monitoring my engine instruments. I was looking at oil pressure, you know, and I'm thinking, okay, we got to make it down. We got to get it on the ground fast. So I put the plane into a tight circle right over the top of the airstrip, and I wanted to make sure that I was going to make that airstrip. So I kept my airspeed up, and as soon as I was sure that I was going to make the end of the airstrip, I reached down and turned the fuel off and turned the engine off, because, you know, I was worried about fire. And we came in over the end of that strip probably 80 miles an hour, touched down really hard, and then I just reefed on the brakes and came just racing up to the end of the strip and spun the airplane around, and the plane stopped, the prop was stopped dead, and I'm just sitting there. You know, it's amazing what that fight or flight response does when it triggers like that in an aircraft. And it took me a few minutes to kind of catch my breath and realize, wow, I just dodged a bullet here. The engine could have blown when I was halfway into the highlands over those dense jungle and swamp areas, or if it would have happened, you know, 5 minutes earlier or 5 minutes later, I would have had to put the plane down in some really rugged mountainous terrain. So as I got out of the airplane, the second thing struck me was I just could not believe what I was looking at. I looked and I thought, from the front of the lower part of the cowling all the way down the side and all over the tail feathers was engine oil. I mean, it looked like the plane had been dipped in oil. So I got my toolkit out. We carry a little toolkit under the seat, and I popped the fasteners for the cowling, lifted the top part of the cowling out, and that's when I was really scared, because I was looking at a cylinder head that had blown off the cylinder, and it had severed the fuel injector line. The fuel injector line had been spraying raw fuel in there right around the area where the exhaust manifold was all cracked. And I thought, boy, I like dodged 2 bullets. And I reached in and pulled the dipstick out, and literally there was no oil. That engine held 8 quarts. In just a few minutes, it pumped all 8 quarts out of that engine, because the pushrod tube housings had separated from the case, and of course oil was just pumping out like crazy. So I looked this situation over, and I thought, how could that have happened? I mean, you know, about 50 hours previously, I had just done a 100-hour inspection. I had looked the plane over. I didn't see any problem. There was no indication that this was going to happen, except for one small thing. I remember back when I started the engine out at the coast, I heard this little kind of poof, poof, poof sound. It almost sounded like a little bit of a compression leak. But, you know, it was like, oh, man, I don't know. Maybe I was just imagining it, because after the engine started, I'm sitting there looking at all the instruments and monitoring the engine instruments and say, hey, everything looks fine, you know, let's head for home. And you pilots out there will know what I'm talking about when I mention get-home-itis, because that's been the downfall of many a pilot. So I had to spend the night, pulled out the old mosquito net, slept in the hut with the local natives, and the next day they flew in the parts to repair the airplane right there on the airstrip. And it wasn't until I was actually going through the process of installing a new cylinder on that engine that I noticed some staining around the fins of the steel barrel, and you could obviously see that it had been leaking. It had been leaking for obviously quite some time, maybe 20 hours, 30 hours, or whatever, because you could see the little staining. And if I would have picked that up on a visual inspection, it would have given me an indication that the head was starting to separate from the barrel. So at that point, I made a commitment. From now on, I'm opening up the engine cowling on my aircraft and inspecting the engine every 25 hours. Not every 100, every 25. And over the next 8 years of flying that aircraft, there were two times that I caught a potential very serious problem by opening up that cowling and looking at that engine on a regular basis. One time it was a crack in the exhaust manifold that would have caused a problem with the turbocharger, and the other time it was a leaking fuel line. Just caught the beginnings of seepage around a swedged fuel line fitting that was developing a leak. So you see, now you know why I am a firm believer in the visual inspection. The other thing I recently caught on a visual inspection on my S500 was deteriorating breather hoses. Now, I have to admit that, breather hoses is not as dangerous as a failed engine in a Cessna 185, but these things can cause some problems if they just totally deteriorate. And the first thing that gave me a clue was this tape around one end of the breather hose. And then as I started looking at them, I began to realize they were all super hard and brittle, and this is a very common thing on these engines over 100,000 miles. Due to heat, these rubber breather hoses will harden and they will crack, and you might even start to get engine fumes into the passenger compartment. So that's just another example of something that you would pick up on a regular visual inspection. And I'm kind of curious because just before I purchased the car, it had been into the dealer for, it's a major service. And I don't know, they missed these breather hoses. So just because a car has been professionally maintained, that does not mean that everything is always going to have been fixed on it. Now, in fairness to mechanics, sometimes the mechanics will point out these problems and the owner will say, well, I just don't have the money to fix it. But in any case, when you get a car, no matter where it's been maintained, no matter who has owned it, you want to give it your own personal visual inspection. I know how important this subject is. I'm actually going to be working on a list, a 150, 200 point checklist for visual inspection. Also, there's one other time that you want to do a good visual inspection on your car, and that's just before a long trip. And I have another video on YouTube where I'm actually looking over an old Mercedes diesel just before the owner was taking it on a 2,000 mile trip. So, hey, anytime you're heading out on a long trip, get your eyes in there and inspect your car. I hope you will become a believer in the importance of a visual inspection.